Greetings and welcome to the very first episode of the ACUHO-I Stories podcast. My name is Grant Walters and I serve as the Director of Educational Programs at the ACUHO-I Home Office here in Columbus, Ohio, and I will also be your host for today. Glad you could join us from wherever in the world you happen to be listening. We're really excited to debut this project, which will bring our listeners in-depth conversations with campus housing professionals and partners from around the globe. For this inaugural episode, our guest is Dr. Alvin Sturdivant, who is the Vice President for Student Development at Seattle University and an ACUHO-I past president. Alvin talks about eminent leadership in his personal and professional life and how he's practiced those aspects in a time of crisis and through a lens of equity and inclusion. Alvin and I recorded this episode back in November of 2020, but as our campuses begin to emerge from the pandemic and contend with pervasive division and racism in and around their communities, Alvin's words continue to be timely and healing. More episodes of this podcast will be on the way shortly, and they will all be linked to our website, which is www.ACUHO-I.org. Without further delay, here's Alvin's story. Alvin, thanks so much for being with us today. You are the first guest on our podcast, and so we really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to talk with us and share some of your insight and your story with us.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this and for having received the invitation.
Absolutely. So start by telling us just a little bit about what you do at Seattle University. You're the Vice President for Student Development. What does your day-to-day responsibility sort of look like, and how do you support housing and residence life in that role?
Sure. So I've been at Seattle University for 11 years now, and in my current role for the past 4. I assumed some responsibility for housing and residence life in 2013 when I was the Associate Vice President for Student Development, and the unit reported directly to me. And in my current role, it maintains a dotted line report. And so the director specifically meets with me once a month, and I'm pretty actively engaged in helping to set our room and board rates and policies and those kinds of things. The broader sort of scope of my responsibilities are associated with the student experience and working with my colleagues all across the campus, both those in student affairs and those outside of our area, to ensure that we're creating a seamless, cohesive, integrated student experience that really gives all of our students an opportunity to thrive and to actively engage with their education in ways that are meaningful and purposeful for them, but also leverages their gifts and their strengths in ways that are very sort of classically Seattle University.
Great. And so we could spend a whole podcast probably talking about your path into the profession, but we won't. But what were some of the important events that initially brought you into campus housing at first?
Sure. So it was circumstance more than anything. Quite honestly, as a first year college student going into my second year, wasn't really interested in anything other than continuing to live on campus. And I happened to be in summer school at the end of my first year of college, and found myself in an argument with another student that was witnessed by my graduate hall director.
Okay.
And honestly, she liked the way I handled myself in that situation. And in my conduct meeting with her, so to speak, asked me if I had ever considered being an RA. And I said, frankly, no, not something I'm interested in. And upon having conversations with my parents about the RA position and the benefits financially, I was convinced by them that it was an opportunity that I should pursue. And turns out I was good at it. I loved it, and continued to do it for my sophomore and my junior year in college, and would have continued doing it my senior year. But I was also involved in student government and was presented with having to make a choice of having a major student government leadership position or being an RA. And at that point in time, I decided to go with student government, although, I remained living on campus during my senior year. And that, turned into a career in housing primarily. Before moving into student affairs administration, I, worked in just about every possible position you could have in housing, ranging from desk assistant to director. And it's how I cut my teeth in the field. It's where I developed the very basic sort of skills and competencies that I continue to utilize in the work that I do today. And quite honestly, is where my fondest memories of my work in student affairs comes from, is the time that I spent in housing, and is one of the primary reasons that I remain connected to ACUHO-I and wanted housing here at my university to have a direct or a dotted line report to me, is because I care very deeply about the work that's happening in housing, and want to continue sort of influencing the direction that it takes.
Great. We've been talking a lot with members and among staff about entry-level professionals and some of the paths they take to come into the profession full-time. And one of the things that's come up in those conversations has been talking about how well we prepare professionals for the actual work of the profession. So in a graduate program, if that's, your path in, you learn about theory, you learn about some application, you learn about possibly what it takes to be published. And it's a very academic sort of perspective, but then you come into a hall director or resident director position and it becomes very practical, and it becomes a lot different, I think, than what maybe you had first thought of. And so what were some of the important things that you learned, or maybe the things you wish you had learned or knew about when you transitioned into your first housing position from your grad experience?
Sure. I think at first my experience was a little bit less traditional than sort of the average student coming out of a grad program, if you will. In that I was in the first cohort of the Higher Education Administration program at North Carolina State University.
Oh, okay.
And most of the faculty in our program were practitioners in the Division of Student Affairs. And so it was a more practically oriented sort of educational experience that I received. I also happened to work in a 3/4 time assistantship, and so I was working 30 hours a week while in grad school as a graduate hall director. And at that particular point in time, there were no full-time hall directors. We were it, and had sole responsibility for the management of our buildings and our RA staffs and our hall councils. And so I offer my next set of comments with that as sort of my backdrop.
Sure.
I went into my first full-time position. I'm feeling largely confident in sort of the experiences that I had leading up to that period in my life. But what I quickly learned was that there was so much more that I didn't know and needed to know in order to be, effective and to really impact the lives of the students that I was charged with working with day to day. And some of those more practical skills that I think, I was lacking at that time was, understanding budgets, understanding supervision, particularly as a young professional, supervising folks who weren't much younger than I was at that particular point in my life. Learning the difference between advising and supervision. Certainly it was an interview question that I got at every step along the way. And I think I had a good answer for it. But being able to apply that in my actual day-to-day work responsibilities was a bit more challenging. I think one of the other pieces was assessment and sort of evaluation and understanding the nuances and the differences, and being able to apply that analysis and understanding to my work, and understanding how to utilize that to affect change in the work was also a little bit more difficult and challenging as a early career professional. One of the other pieces that I was learning to sort of navigate. And again, this is something that they tackle in the curriculum, but you don't really understand it until you're on the job, is the politics of higher education and really trying to navigate that. I went from the Southern United States to the Northeast, and the politics of geography alone were difficult. But then you tag in the politics of higher education and making the transition from a public institution to a private institution. It just was very different than what I was prepared for. But fortunately, I had great mentors and supervisors who were able to assist me in sort of upping my understanding and helping me to access professional development opportunities and training opportunities that ultimately equipped me to be able to do that work in ways that were meaningful for me, meaningful for my career, but most importantly, meaningful for the students that I was working with.
Right. Well, that's a great segue. So you and I, as we exchanged some emails about this podcast and about what we'd be talking about, we had sort of landed on being able to discuss the importance of leadership in a time of great crisis. And so thinking about those people who mentored you, who are the individuals in your life or along your career path that modeled exemplary leadership?
Sure. So first and foremost, the number one sort of influence in my life was my grandmother, who in every way that counts was really my mother. And so, every lesson that I know to be true about leadership and how to lead in good times and bad times really came from my grandmother. In addition to her, and she's been gone since 1997 and yet is still a very powerful and meaningful influence in my life. But in addition to her, there have been a number of folks through, the years of my career. Tom Ellett was my first director at Syracuse University and is one of the primary reasons that I chose to uproot myself from my comfort in North Carolina and the Southeast and move, up to the northern tier of the U.S. And, he continues to be a big influence in my life, watching the way he leads in the way he engages with students and staff members was a phenomenal model for me and a number of other folks. Stacy Miller, who was my director when I was the associate director of Res Life at the University of Vermont, was also a huge influence in my life and helped me understand, how to prioritize myself and my family while also balancing work in school and continues to be that sort of a presence for me. Kent Porterfield, who I think took a risk on me and hired me as his director of housing residence life at St. Louis University when I myself wasn't sure I was ready, so to speak, to take on that level of leadership and continues again now that I work in a Jesuit context and he continues to work in this context, continues to be a great model for leadership. And two others from the University of Vermont, Robert Kelly, who recruited me there and now is at Loyola University in Maryland, and Jacob Diaz, who was a part of the search committee that hired me and is now at University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Those are two folks that are still a part of my governing board, so to speak.
Sure.
That when I need to, run things by folks or consult or be advised about the challenges that we are experiencing in our work or in life in general, that I know I can still lean on and call upon. The example that they continue to set for me and for others is pretty amazing. And it was through those last two that, this sort of mantra, if you will, that we used to talk about quite extensively. Are you invested or committed to my retention? Invested in or committed to my retention came up quite frequently in my time at the University of Vermont, which was quite challenging for me as a Black person living in New England. It's something that I, continue to carry with me as I think about, providing mentorship and modeling of my own leadership for my team and for students and others who are watching me given the fishbowl that we live in is that there's a part of me that has to be committed to the retention of my students and my staff in ways that are really grounded in relationship and connection. And all the folks that I've listed off are folks that modeled that for me and were invested not only in how I was developing as a professional, but also as a person. And that is critical, I think, to anyone who is setting an example for others.
Great, thank you. Well, thinking about your leadership over the past 8 months on your campus, I shudder to use the term in unprecedented times, but obviously that's what we're living and working in. And so the campus housing has been impacted on so many levels, both expected and unexpected, I think. And so what have been the most important things in your mind as a leader that you've done over the past 8 months to help your community through those big changes and those, circumstances that, we probably didn't imagine we'd be in last year at this time?
Sure. It's interesting. I think, the first thing that sort of immediately comes to mind is, in my role as vice president, I am, not typically on the front lines in sort of managing the day-to-day kinds of things that are going on for our community and our students in particular. In the last 8 months, I think I've been thrust back into that in ways that I don't think any of us could have ever really imagined, and have been at the table making, along with my colleagues, both in the Division of Student Affairs, Student Development, and those across the university, making really critical decisions about what we are doing in response to COVID-19 and the myriad of other issues and pandemics that we're experiencing, like racial justice, that have real life implications for our students and their families. And so, I've been pretty well involved and engaged in all of these things, including, setting policy, helping to make decisions about whether or not we will actually open for any in-person classes, trying to determine what our capacity would be for housing, just given, what we know from the CDC, what we know from public health, and what we also know from the state of Washington in terms of its own guidance and regulations with regards to COVID-19. Working directly with my team to understand how to pivot in this time where we are primarily remote and virtual, but have the same obligation and the same need to help build community.
Sure.
And to keep our students connected to the university. This was particularly more challenging, given that our first year students, lost the end of their senior year of high school, and to some degree have lost that more sort of traditional experience of beginning college. And so, trying to figure out with the team, what does this need to look like? What is it that we absolutely need to do? What is it that we can sort of pull back on given the financial constraints that are upon us, given, we are at a place where we have reduced enrollment, retention has been impacted, given that there are a number of students who've decided to take gap years. We have some of our first year students living on campus, but we have a good number of them also studying from a number of different places throughout the US and throughout the world. And yet our obligation is to try and build community in that context and with that as the frame. And so helping folks understand, what our students are experiencing, helping our students understand that we really know that this is a very different kind of experience for them, and yet we are committed to their development, and recognizing for our staff that this is not a learning or engagement medium that is conducive to the styles of all of our students. And so how to appropriately respond and adapt to that in ways that represent our nimbleness and our flexibility and our adaptability is critical to being able to carve out that kind of experience that I was discussing a bit earlier. And so I think the baseline is sort of being big picture and visionary in this environment while also being on the front lines and having to make, day-to-day weed level decisions around testing and dining and housing that, typically, our teams in each of those areas would have responsibility for.
You spoke about that high level lens versus the sort of front lines lens. Obviously, good leadership is important on multiple levels in our profession. And so, thinking about our entry level and our mid level staff, what does good leadership look like in times like this on those levels? What are some important things or attributes that you think are critical to their success in leading communities through turbulent times?
Sure. The two, areas that I have found to be the most helpful to my own leadership and from those that I'm being led by to some degree has been transparency and communication. That the more we are able to share out information with our stakeholders and our constituents, the better off I think we will all be. Even if that information isn't the information that folks want or the information that they desired, if we're able to communicate it in ways that are transparent and provide them with, framing and context and really some rationale for why this and not that, I found that really to be helpful to being able to bring my own division along as we've had to, transition and shift, sometimes every hour, sometimes a couple of times a week, sometimes once a week. But that's just sort of the environment that we're currently in. The other piece that I think I found really helpful is providing space for a couple of different things. One, a space for the team to be able to reflect on what we are experiencing collectively, what we're experiencing individually, and being able to dig into that a bit with one another. I also have found it helpful to provide spaces for us to be in community with one another. One of the things that I think folks miss the most is the opportunity to gather with our colleagues, particularly for campuses like mine that are primarily remote. Right now, and even in these virtual environments and using that as the medium, just being together where there's no agenda and having an opportunity to socialize with one another and to play games or whatever you build for your folks, I have found to be really important. And then the other piece that I find important, so there's COVID, and then there's the racial injustice stuff that is circling all about us, and that's even more amplified given the election season and what's been happening with that rhetoric and so on and so forth. Being able to acknowledge the impact of all of those things on our campus, but also on our individual persons, and being able to talk openly about those things in the context of our work has been, I think, also critically important. One in acknowledgement that these are just not typical times for us. In that there's also some trauma associated with the times that we're living through right now. And while our work is important, it is not the most important thing in our world. And that probably actually is the number one, leadership lesson, I think, that I have found even more so than transparency and communication is recognizing the need to preserve the health and safety of our individual students and individual faculty and staff, while acknowledging that the greatest priorities in our lives aren't the things that we do for our universities. It's really about our community. It's really about our family, our friends, and those folks who are most important to us, and doing everything that we can to keep them safe. I think all those things sort of together really sort of represent, what I think is most important and most critical for, those of us in leadership to sort of bear in mind and to prioritize as we are engaging with our teams.
So thinking about that, that sort of lens of inclusion and justice and equity in the work that student affairs people in general, I think, have to do right now. Thinking about housing and residence life specifically, what do you believe those professionals need to do above all else to ensure that the work they're doing for students and faculty and their colleagues and their communities is inclusive and just?
Sure. So I mean, it to some degree, goes back to where I left off, just sort of recognizing the individual worth and dignity of all of our students and all of our staff members, in who they are, and what comes along with them in these environments. So, I'll use myself as an example. When I enter into an environment or into a space, I'm bringing all of who I am into that space, and my most salient identities are really associated with my being a Black African American man in this world. That's sort of how I enter into a space, and I recognize that many of our students and many of our staff members, when they enter into a new environment or an old environment, or into a space, they're bringing a variety of different parts of themselves into that space, and part of our obligation, particularly in a housing setting, is to create space and opportunity for students to be authentic and to be able to thrive, whatever their lived experiences and backgrounds are. I think also creating an opportunity for students in particular, and also from a training perspective, our staff members to engage with one another across difference, and to develop the skills and competencies required to engage in this world where intersectionality and engagement are really important, is also critical. The other piece from an equity and inclusion perspective is just acknowledging, again, as I noted earlier, the times that we find ourselves in. And while, quite honestly, the things that have brought us here aren't new. It's truly a representation of this white supremacist structure that has existed for generations and generations and generations.
Yes.
The way society and universities are responding to it is new, and the way housing departments is responding to it is absolutely new, and has a new sort of urgency that I don't think was there before. And I can't really explain where that urgency comes from, but perhaps it's been amplified by the dual pandemics that we find ourselves in sort of acknowledging that, in building an ecosystem that is responsive to that, and continues to be responsive, but also is nimble enough to adapt where necessary, and invites all the various voices in ways that are safe and healthy, and productive, but not damaging and harmful and disruptive, which is easier said than done, but certainly I think a role that housing and res life can play, just given, that we typically are getting students at the outset of their college experience, and when they are, to some degree, empty vessels, really open to be pushed and challenged in ways that they've not been up to this point in their lives.
So thinking about what housing professionals do really well, and of course the generalist role of a housing professional means that they have to be really, really good at so many different things. What, in terms of inclusion and equity work, do you think the profession excels at, and where are the places where there are gaps that still need to be addressed or given more attention from your perspective?
Sure. I think we have historically done a great job at prepping our staff to work in these diverse and multicultural environments. Student staff, professional staff, grad staff, whatever it might be, really equipping them with the skills and the competencies to engage with students in really meaningful ways around identity and those kinds of things. Where I think we have fallen short and aren't necessarily doing as well is in that skill and competency piece with our students.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily about indoctrination, but it is about introducing students to new and different perspectives. And I don't know that we've accepted that challenge sort of unilaterally, across our campuses. I think, so that's one sort of practical piece. I think one of the other significant pieces is, programmatically, higher education in general, but certainly this applies in housing. I think to some degree amplifies the differences between the haves and the have-nots. In issues of access are still relatively significant on many of our campuses. The ability to access, a variety of different housing models and types, accessing programmatic opportunities. When we look at it through the lens of socioeconomic class and status, certainly has been a factor. Our ability to address, food security matters and issues for our students has been a fairly significant gap for a number of campuses through the years. And housing, of course, can play a significant role in that. I think one of the other sort of significant gaps is, looking at how we're connecting students to one another in those, training opportunities and programming opportunities, particularly students whose viewpoints and ideological perspectives are different. We have not figured that out. And that has been a real challenge in so many ways.
Sure.
And so those tend to be some of the voids and gaps. I will note another area where I think we are doing really good work is recognizing the demographic shifts that are occurring in
Yes.
our, in higher ed in general, but more particularly in housing and how those demographic shifts, whatever they might be, are influencing the way students are experiencing one another and college and us as leaders. That has been sort of a growing sort of area of improvement through the years, and in an area where I think we've made some seismic improvements, quite honestly, that 10 or so years ago, there were things that weren't being done that we're now doing that really resonate with our student bodies, given the shifts demographically that have occurred.
So thinking about everything that's transpired in the profession and in the world over the past 8 months or so, we've mourned the loss of many things. We've experienced a lot of trauma for people that has been incredibly personal. It's been threatening. It's been sometimes a matter of life or death. And so there's a lot that I think people are contending with. And I think people are clinging to the hope, obviously, that we're going to come out of this at some point in the future with something learned, something gained. In your mind, thinking about all the things we've just talked about, what are the things that you think that the housing profession will come out with being stronger for at the end of all of this, when we're able to go back more in person, where we're able to have those more intimate relationships one-on-one with students and colleagues and things like that? What do you think will make the profession stronger?
Sure. I think to some degree, it is represented in the ability to pivot that we demonstrated, and initially responding to COVID-19 in the subsequent months, as we've sort of remained in this sort of state and environment, that we have learned that while the brick and mortar experience is essential and a critical part of the experiences that students have in college, that we can certainly reach far more students when we utilize technology to our advantage. And so being able to provide services and programs virtually that we never even considered before has given us the ability to tap into a set of students who previously weren't utilizing our services or attending our programs and events. I think that's definitely a lesson that we'll take away from all of this, and one that applies, I think, across all of higher ed and not just in housing, but certainly housing will benefit. I think our students have likely recognized how more essential this experience of living on campus was for them than they even knew before. Based on what we're hearing, from actually students living on campus and students who are coming to us remotely about not feeling like they can build community virtually in the same way as they could in person, in being able to sort of capitalize on that to some degree and build out the ideals of building community in ways that didn't exist before. I think the other pieces, and I don't know that these are necessarily lessons learned, but certainly changes in policy and protocol that will likely follow us. Thinking about how we assign roommates, thinking about how we set up furniture in lounges, and what our policies will look like in terms of capacity in lounges and kitchens and laundry rooms and those things going forward. Certainly it's my hope that we don't find ourselves experiencing a pandemic of this magnitude again in our lifetimes, but who knows, quite honestly.
Right.
And so as we go forward, we'll absolutely need to be thinking about the preservation of the health and safety of our communities. And that'll certainly be on the minds of our students and their family members. And so we'll need to absolutely ensure that we're building out policies and protocols that bear these things in mind. The other piece that I think we will take away from this is how to work more so in a resource-constrained environment. Certainly we were already in a depleting resources environment, just given sort of the downward trend with enrollment and the reducing number of students graduating from high school and the impact that was having on higher ed. But this has, made that a bit more pronounced, and we'll have to be responsive to that. And then the last piece that I'm thinking about in terms of lessons learned is how we go about just prepping students for this new environment and ensuring that they understand, what it means to be in this environment where there'll be some services offered in person and some other services offered virtually, and helping them to establish some degree of comfort with existing in that kind of an environment. Though, 8 months later, I think our students are getting really comfortable with it, though very annoyed and to some degree really, really over it in the same way that I'm over it. I think our students are over it. But I also recognize that this is not our new normal. I don't like that framing, but certainly just sort of the way it will be for us. I think we'll find some folks will continue wearing face coverings even after, there's a vaccine and the pandemic, COVID at least, is long gone for their own sort of sanity and security in some ways. And that's just, things won't look the same. Things won't ever be the same or feel the same. And I think that's a good thing because it really positions us to be more responsive and available to those that we weren't available to before.
Thank you. Excellent perspective. So thank you so much for sharing those viewpoints with us. We're going to turn it over to sort of a set of questions that we want to ask all of our podcast guests. And so we'll turn the proverbial camera back on you individually again, so to speak. What has been the most rewarding aspect, if you could name something, of the work you did in housing and residence life?
It's really interesting. There are a number of things that were rewarding about my work in housing and residence life, dating back to when I was an RA and and had hallway conversations, really organic, informal hallway conversations with, my residents, who some of are lifelong friends and I'm still connected to in really fascinating and great ways, to being able to sit in a room and dig deeply into issues with my colleagues. When I was a residence director or an AD or a director, those things that were front of mind for us and for our students, and really problem solving together some of the bigger problems and questions that we were charged with providing a response to. I think really fondly of. I think the thing that I think the fondest of, though, are those mentoring relationships that I've benefited from as a mentee and as a mentor. Just being able to engage, one-on-one, folks who know me really well, and likely those that don't know me that well, but have observed me from a distance, can likely tell that I'm very relational, very people-oriented, and my preference is for one-on-one or small groups. And, that's because I have the ability to really develop really rich relationships where we can engage in really thoughtful conversations with one another. And there have been none better for me than with my own mentors and with those that I provide mentorship with. In the moments when I question why I still do this work, certainly those are the more challenging times, and this is one of those. Right. What I draw back to are those many meaningful exchanges, and as you can tell, those are all grounded in being connected to people. Yes. And that's the absolute thing that has been the most rewarding part of working in housing. The other piece for me is, and you referenced this earlier, the generalist nature of the work. I feel like I cut my teeth in housing residence life. I always use, I think about housing res life work in the same way I think about teaching hospitals, that folks who come to us are coming to develop their skills and their competencies so that they can move on to the next phase or the next level of their career. And there's so many, skills and competencies that you need to learn at each level. And that's sort of the obligation that I always felt when I was working in leadership in housing and residence life, that these were my residence directors or my area coordinators or my assistant directors. And there were, these very clear learnings that needed to occur. And that was our role and our responsibility to them in, watching that growth and that development happen is also very rewarding for me. And in particular, for folks who work in housing, especially considering that housing more than everyone else is on the front lines, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And there's nothing more challenging than that, but also nothing more rewarding than that. And just seeing, the outcomes of all of that commitment and that work, which is manifest in the transformation that we don't always see initially in our students, but with the long-term investment we do. And sometimes long after they've graduated from the university, like that is what it's all about for me. And again, that work, I think most critically happens in our hallways of the residences, in ways that just can't be duplicated in the other areas of the profession.
So thinking about you've spoken at length, obviously, about your time as a campus housing professional, now as a VP, but also your experience as an ACUHO-I president and the perspective that you gained there. What do you think is the big capital C challenge that is facing the campus housing profession in the future?
8 months ago, my answer might have been a little bit different than the answer that I provide now. But certainly my thinking about this is influenced by COVID-19 and racial injustice significantly.
Of course.
So, I think, the value add question has always been a big one. And I think it will remain a big one, particularly given that many of our campuses have gone for, a window with having far fewer students living with us on campus. And so, helping folks understand what the value of a residential experience is and how it contributes to the overall education of students remains, I think, a critical part of our work ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
I think the utilization of technology also remains a pretty critical part of our work in utilizing it in ways that we weren't thinking about, again, before COVID-19. In this transition to a virtual and remote learning and engagement environment will be work ahead of us. The resource question is also a big one with the impact of COVID and the reduction that many of us have seen and or loss of revenue that we've seen and the impact that will have on us both short term and long term is something that we will grapple with. The continuing diversifying of our student body and of our field of professionals and what that means for our work will also be pretty significant. And then the other piece connected to that is digging in more specifically around issues of racism and sexism and homophobia in the number of issues that will come up. Regulatory and compliance related matters are also pretty significant for our work in housing and residence life. They and given just the changes that have occurred in the last 2 years alone have been pretty significant. And depending on the outcome of tomorrow's election, will really dictate the path that we will take in the way of a number of these regulations that have come out more recently. But that is work that housing res life folks are on the front lines of. And then the last piece that I will offer is related to sort of the sort of professionalization of the field in the work that we do. And that's certainly something that we talked about quite extensively in my time as ACUHO-I president. And I know it's a conversation that has continued since then. But making sure that our folks are adequately and appropriately prepared for the work that we do, but also for the future and how the work will shift and evolve, I think is really critical in being able to utilize our networks in ways to help inform how we are moving in this field globally is important.
Great. My very last question for you is, what is your greatest hope for the future of the profession?
Sure. So my greatest hope, is that we will continue to influence and transform the lives of students and one another, that we will continue to be on the ground and on the front lines with our students, that we will continue to help them grapple with the big questions that are personal to them, that we will continue to be involved in the development of their identity, and that we will invest fully in who each of our students is becoming, and that we won't get lost in this collective residence notion, but that we will recognize the individuality and the uniqueness of each of our students. And lastly, that this will be the moment that we can find ourselves in now will be a snapshot in time that we will look back on and we'll, of course, see the challenges, but we'll recognize that we emerge from it stronger, better, and more equipped to move into the future than we were ever before. And so those are really the hopes that I have.
Good. Well, Alvin, thank you so much for joining us, for being the very first guest on our podcast. But we also greatly value your leadership and your partnership in the profession. And so thank you for everything that you do to support students and staff and also the association. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you again.
No, Grant, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. It has been an absolute pleasure. And I hope that folks will find some nugget in what I've offered today.
I know they will. Thanks,
All right,
Alvin.
thank you.
And that concludes our first episode of the ACUHO-I Stories podcast. I'd like to thank Dr. Alvin Sturdivant for his candid thoughts and observations, and for his continued support of the association, and to all of you for listening. More episodes of this podcast will be released very soon, and you'll be able to find them and many more initiatives, events, and resources on our website, www.acuho-i.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn for more news and events. I'm Grant Walters, and it's been a pleasure being your host. Until next time, I hope you and yours stay safe and healthy.